In hands-on number 8, we'll talk about service call activities, and that means about calling external services during simulation. You can have a number of motivations for calling external services during simulation. One of them is to get some enrichment information for your data, because sometimes it's better not to store everything in your data model and simply query some service for the data you need. Another use case may be if you need to propagate some internal state to downstream systems. For example, if your virtual service simulates approving and rejection of some transactions, you may need to tell about this rejection or approval also to other systems that somehow participate on your tests in your environment. Very frequently, people use service call activities to implement so-called async HTTP call. Well, there is nothing async in HTTP, but sometimes you want your virtual service to retrieve result immediately, like some status saying we are working on it. And once you generate the result after some time, you want to send this result in a request to some external URL. For this last use case, we have even a special video that you can watch. The issue we'll want to mitigate in hands-on number 8 is that the portfolio suggestion team was wrong again when they insisted that Iran was the only country on the sanctions list. There is actually a microservice in the company returning information on countries facing sanctions, and there's quite a lot of them. And we need to consume this microservice before they can fix it on the real service side. So instead of that simple rule that only handles sanctions for Iran, we'll create something much more versatile that will handle sanctions for all the countries. For that purpose, we'll use a service call activity to consume the sanctions microservice. In this hands-on, we'll first undeploy the virtual service that we used in data masking and stateful simulation exercises, and we'll deploy the original service. Then we'll import a new REST service call activity with this endpoint. So let me put it to clipboard. And these are our sample request and sample response. But better would be if we take it here from our sample data. It's this SCA request and SCA response XML file. Service call activities can be shared by multiple services in your project, as you can see here in the Special Training Services project. In order to add a service call activity, we need to specify details about its contract first. But before we do it, let's undeploy this data masking portfolio suggestion service by clicking undeploy. I'll also close the related tabs. And let's instead deploy again this original version of the portfolio suggestion service, and let's put it to simulation. Okay, so here inside this data model, we'll want to create a more versatile version of this rule. So let me disable it since we'll not need it in the future. And now how to add a new service call activity. So you can do it here in this activity menu by clicking import activities. Here, the wizard that will pop up looks a lot like a wizard for adding a new virtual service. So you can specify a WSDL file if you have it available, but we don't. So I'll select that I don't have a service description. And here you can see all the various protocols you can use when calling an external service. And this is just a subset of all the protocols. Not every protocol can be used to call an external service using service call activity, but definitely REST is one of the most used protocols for calling external services. So we'll select REST, and here we have to specify an agent. We'll select the HTTPS gateway agent. And you may ask why we need to specify an agent, because this service call activity is about calling some external URL, and that external URL listens elsewhere. So the reason why we need to specify the agent here is that agents might have some special settings, like for example the certificate or some other security settings for other protocols. In this case, it's not so important. This HTTPS gateway has nothing special in it. What's more important is to get this endpoint right. Okay, I'll press next. And now we'll select this second option. which is what I usually do. I usually prepare the service call activity and only then I insert it somewhere in my data model. I'll press Finish. You can see the service call activity here in this menu. And you can also see that by clicking this or this menu action, you can either add this service call activity before a response or after response. If you add it before response, then that external service will be called before the virtual service generates its response. That's useful if you want to query some external URL and get some enrichment data to use before you generate response of the virtual service. So that will be our case because we want to query the sanctions service, and based on the result, whether there is sanctions or not, will produce the appropriate response type. The after response service call activity is good, for example, for that HTTP async call, meaning for calling some external URL after your virtual service will produce its response. But before adding the service call activity to our data model, we need to specify its input and output structures, and we'll do this by clicking Learn Schema from Messages. And here, let's specify service call activity request. And the response. The method will be post. I'll click OK. And now the service call activity knows how its request and response looks like. Okay, we are ready to add the service call activity to our data model. To make this possible, we'll create this new rule called external sanctions service. And to this new rule, we'll add the service call activity as before response. Let's call it check sanctions. We can review the URL, the agent and timeout, and press OK. Now you can see we have this additional block of fields inside our data model. So there is not just the request of the virtual service and the response of the virtual service, but also this special block before response, which has these two subsections. This one is to specify the request of the sanction service, and this one is to consume its response. In this new rule, we'll only call the sanction service and we'll consume it elsewhere. And I'll explain later why we need two rules, not just one. Let's add a new row and display it in row detail. And now, since we want this row to always match, let's specify as little conditions as possible. So let's ignore everything. And let's not set the type here because this row will be just about calling the sanctioned service. Let's display the request of the sanctioned service here. And here let's display the request of the virtual service because in fact we will need to copy this citizenship field as the input of the service call activity to this country to check. So let's here use the copy from function. Let's copy the value from the citizenship field. Okay, to successfully call the sanction service, we also need to specify a couple of parameters, like the URI path that should be specified as empty, as well as the method that should be post, and the transport that should be HTTPS. And besides that, we need to go to the Activity Service Description Editor and enable two metadata fields, namely the content type and the accept header. And we'll set both to text XML. Okay, so let's save it for now. And I'll show you how to get to the Activity Service Description Editor. You need to right-click here and select this option. In Request, we want to enable this accept header and this content type header. Let's press OK. And you can see the two new fields here. So let's perhaps fill it from here. Okay, I think now we should be ready to test this rule that calls the service call activity. So let me switch the service to simulation and let's test it. I don't see any warning in the problem list. Let's perhaps switch on the message logging to inspect the messages we sent to the service call activity. I clicked send again, and here in the log you can see this special symbol. And that special symbol means that the service call activity called check sanctions was executed. Here in the drop-down, besides the request and response of the virtual service, you can now also see the request and response of the service call activity. So we correctly copied the value of Spain from request, and the service call activity retrieved this result, so there is no sanctions on Spain. Okay, let's create another rule that will use the result of this service call activity. And as specified in step number 3, this rule should be called like this: retrieve unsupported if country faces sanctions. And here we'll create a new row. And we don't want any condition on virtual service request, because what we want is a condition on the response of the service call activity. So if we get that sanctions XML that we saw in the message log, and if at the same time sanctions in effect field is equal to true, only then this row should match, and only then in the response of the service call activity we should produce unsupported with message stating that the country is on a sanctions list. Okay, let's restart simulation and test it. So for Spain, we get the original response. For Iran, we get this unsupported response type. Let's test it for Russia as well. And that's unsupported as well, because as we can see in the message log, if we check Russia, the response is that sanctions are in effect. Now, why we needed these two rules? Why we can't simply set up the condition here in this check sanctions response? Well, the reason is that if we specify that condition here, then this row would never match, because it would wait indefinitely for this response to be retrieved. And this response would never be retrieved if this row doesn't match first, and if this request isn't generated and sent to the sanctions service. Okay, let's go to the dashboard and test whether the service call activity works as required. And it seems it does. And not only that, the dashboard also checked all these previous features. So seems like at this stage everything works as expected. Before the end of this video, let's perhaps also have a look for a moment how service call activities look like inside this simulation report. So let's press send again, and let's go to the message log. So here is the simulation report. To see where service call activities were called, you can check this show service call activities. So actually you can see the service call activity was called here. And now it is clearer why the simulation algorithm sometimes needs multiple steps. It is because when we called this service call activity, this rule that evaluates the result of the service call activity finally matched. It couldn't match in the cycle number 1. but it matched in cycle number 2 in step 11 after we received a response from the service call activity. So sometimes some rules may match later in one of these next simulation algorithm cycles. The last cycle is there usually to check no other action is to be performed. And if no other action is to be performed, the simulation algorithm finishes. And this is also the reason why order of these two rules doesn't matter all too much, because this call external service rule will be executed in cycle 1 and this retrieve unsupported rule will be executed in cycle number 2. So it may be a bit counterintuitive that I added them in this order, but that simply doesn't matter. For a service call activity, you can also disable it by clicking this symbol, or you can ignore it. Think about this flag as if it was another column. In this rule, you can either set it to enabled or to disabled, or you simply don't touch the value.